You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Welcome back, everybody, to Fire University. Today we're going to talk about upland hardwoods again, particularly oak forests. Many of our listeners I know either work or own land within the southern Appalachians or the central hardwoods regions. So we're trying to spend some time on that, particularly because we've had some problems in that system, or some perceived problems at least, with oak transition to other forest types. So I have Dr. Heather Alexander and Dr. Steve Brewer here with me today. And I wanted to allow both of you to tell us a little bit about yourselves before we get started.
All right, I'll go first. So I am a professor at Auburn University, and I just started here. I had spent 5 years at Mississippi State University in the forestry department before coming here, but I'm in the School of Forestry and Wildlife Sciences. And a pretty big chunk of my research program is thinking about the role of fire in upland hardwood forests. So working mostly in oak forest and the Appalachians, and like Marcus said, the central hardwood forest region. Been thinking about, putting fire back into those systems and how important it is for maintaining, especially oak and hickory species. So something I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Well, I'm Steve Brewer, and I'm a professor of biology at the University of Mississippi. My training has been in plant ecology, and I've, for a long time since graduate school, have been interested in fire and how plants respond to fire, plant adaptations to fire, how fire influences species diversity. And I've been at Ole Miss since '96, and most of my work with fire has been either in upland oak or mixed oak shortleaf pine ecosystems, or in longleaf pine ecosystems, particularly the lower kind of wet savanna ecosystems. So I kind of split my time between those systems. And I've been, I started a long-term experiment of fire restoration at a place called Strawberry Plains Audubon Preserve in northern Mississippi back in 2004. And I've been, interested in those questions for quite a while.
Very cool. I just wanted to interject for those of you that know about the Mississippi State Ole Miss rivalry. We can still have a reasonable conversation together. So just wanted to point that out, that Heather and I both were faculty, and I even got my undergrad at Mississippi State, and we're still able to talk with Ole Miss. So
last year, actually, Marcus, Steve and I met up at first at Strawberry Plains, he just described, and then we went over to a site that you and I work on in northern Mississippi. But we took a picture of both of our field trucks nose to nose, so you could see both of the logos, and then posted it on the website so we could prove that there truly can be collaboration between those two universities.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know about Auburn and Alabama, but
we're not going there yet.
Not going there?
We're not going there yet. maybe one day.
At least the three universities with University of Florida as well, we can all communicate to one another in a reasonable, prudent manner. So yeah, so the reason I wanted to have both of you on the show is because you're experts in this area with upland hardwoods and particularly the role of fire in that system. And I worked with you recently on a manuscript that just got accepted in bioscience. So we'll put a link to that on social media at UF Lab so that people can look at it if they're interested. But when I worked with you guys on that, it really made me understand that, I was taking upland oak dominated hardwood forest for granted a little bit. I just wanted either of you, whoever wants to chime in, to tell us a little bit about what's going on in these forest systems.
I can start, and then Steve can maybe chime in with his perspective on this. But yeah, that bioscience paper was really cool and kind of fun to write because we started out thinking about a lot of the observations that have been made in upland oak forest across the eastern U.S. primarily. But what people have been observing and measuring in studies is this phenomena where if you walk through the forest, you'll be like, oh, wow, there are a lot of big oak trees, lots of big ones. You look into the canopy, lots of oak leaves, and down on the ground, you see lots of oak litter. But then when you start looking for kind of mid-size saplings and mid-story oaks, they're really missing from those size classes. You might see some seedlings because oak acorns will germinate and you'll get some little guys coming up, but those kind of intermediate size classes are absent. And this is something, it's called the oak bottleneck, basically. So if you imagine like a bottle and how it kind of comes together around the neck, that's the phenomenon. Lots of big oaks, is the wide part of the bottle, and the mouth of the bottle are the seedlings, but there's this constriction in the middle. And, people are really worried about this because oaks are so important for our wildlife species. They produce a mast or an acorn, and, all sorts of things depend on that. But they're also really important because they control things like how water moves through the forest and how nutrients are cycled. And what we're going to talk about in a little bit, I think, is the flammability of the forest. And so we're seeing, changes in what species are starting to occupy those middle size classes. What that means is when the big oaks die, they're going to be the ones that replace them. And so not only are we seeing changes in the composition, but we're also seeing a lot more of those little non-oak guys hanging out in the mid-story. And so it's getting much more dense, much more shady, and that's changing all sorts of things. And so Steve, he thinks a lot about the herbaceous layer, so the non-woody things that grow in the understory. So we're seeing that change too.
Yeah, I became interested. I actually got my start with fire ecology studying longleaf pine ecosystems, and those were open systems with a very diverse grassy understory. And as Heather said, I was very interested in trying to understand the herbaceous plant communities. And it was only secondarily, after I came to Ole Miss, that I got more interested in oak-dominated ecosystems because in northern Mississippi, that's one of the dominant systems is oak or oak mixed with shortleaf pine, which are fairly similar systems with regard to fire regimes. But the thing that I notice is what Heather mentioned and what's been written about in the literature quite a bit, and that is this these more or less closed canopy forests with very sparse understories, oaks in the canopy, seedlings on the ground, but not a lot of mid-story. And one of the things that interested me is that if were the several studies showing that fire alone didn't seem to be kind of turning it back to this system in which you'd have natural oak regeneration in the system. And it made me think, well, yeah, I mean, really, probably what is needed is a more open canopy so that, in addition to fire, and that made me think about well, if you open up the canopy and burn, you're going to get a lot more herbaceous species responding to those kinds of treatments. And so I've been interested in, looking at that, how opening the canopy and restoring frequent fire, how that affects not only oak regeneration, but also how it affects the diversity of ground cover species that were indicative of open, oak woodlands in the past, species that are important wildlife, food plants or cover plants. And so, yeah, that's what I've been interested in.
Well, I think it's probably the more wildlife focused out of us. Those same characteristics that you're talking about that developed understory with the herbaceous component is really important structurally for a lot of the species that we're interested, wildlife species, and managing for. So it's interesting to get your take on it. So it sounds like we have a lot of mature oaks in the overstory, and they're producing acorns, which is important, but we're in this closed canopy system in most of the range that we're talking about now, right? So we don't have much sunlight getting through. And it sounds like, Heather, you said that the seed, the acorns may germinate and produce seedlings, but you'd think if that was happening every year, some of those would eventually make it into the mid-story, and that's not happening.
No, and actually it's pretty amazing, because what's happening is a lot of those seedlings are just hanging out on the forest floor, barely surviving. Like they're getting enough light that they can produce just enough, sugar and carbon to sustain themselves, but they're not growing any bigger. They're basically just getting out competed for light by all these other things that are coming in. And so then the question becomes, well, why is this happening? Why are all these things coming in? And that's where fire comes into the story, right? Because if you start looking back about kind of the history of the system and when this, I guess what you would call a problem, started to happen, where these systems were getting really, really dense and you weren't getting a lot of what we call regeneration of oak in those mid-story classes. It kind of correlates time-wise with when we started to intentionally suppress fire in this country, which was around the 1930s or so, when we had the big push for, put out all fires are bad. There's been some reconstructions of forests. Todd Hutchinson, who's with the Forest Service, published a cool paper a while back that showed that basically, if you look at the number of oaks that were regenerating prior to that 1930s era, there were quite a bit, and hardly any regeneration of species like red maple, which is kind of like the poster child for this invasion of the mid-story by non-oak species. That was when oaks started failing to regenerate, and species like red maple started to take over right around that 1930s period, right when we started suppressing fire. And then there's all sorts of like cool paleoecological records that they get out of sediment cores of lakes, where they can show, because pollen of different trees like looks different, right? So they can go back and they can section these cores in the lake. The deeper you go, the further back in time you go, and you can look at which pollen of what trees was occurring when, and then charcoal also shows up in those cores. So you can correlate like when there were periods of high fire, periods of low fire. And there's a pretty good relationship between species like pine and oaks being dominant across the landscape and the prevalence of fire, while species like red maple and sugar maple, cherry, things like that weren't doing as well. Now we're seeing exactly the opposite. So there's all sorts of evidence that's sort of linking the prevalence of oaks and pines with fire. I mean, they have a lot of adaptations too that show that they have evolved in the presence of fire, like really thick bark and that awesome resprouting capacity, and real drought tolerance. And usually sites that are droughty are also, or sites that are droughty are those that burn really well. So tons of evidence in the literature kind of linking this issue that we're seeing, this transition in composition and structure with fire exclusion.
That's really interesting, but it's also, it leads one to think, oh, well, if excluding fire from the system started this process where we're moving away from oak dominance, and that's limiting oaks from regenerating into this mid-story. It seems intuitive that you would just add fire back to the system and you would get those back. But it sounds like even in that case, if you do add fire back, you don't necessarily increase oak regeneration into those classes. So I thought there was something interesting in that paper that we started to explore. And the system has changed in a lot of ways that would kind of coincide with that same time frame. The one that I always go back to, because I just think it's really interesting to think about, is we don't have a billion passenger pigeons flying around in a flock, landing on the trees, breaking all the limbs out of it, and defecating on the forest floor. We also don't have chestnut anymore, which was apparently the most common tree, right? So there's a lot of things that have changed in that system at the same time, and it kind of muddies the water up a little bit. Do you think those kinds of changes are also influencing this process and maybe making it a little bit harder for us to tackle this issue?
I'll say something about that. I think it's very difficult to know, what impact the loss of those species, has had on these ecosystems. We do know that in most of the southern Appalachians and even parts of the upper coastal plain, American chestnut was, a major component of those forests. And people have kind of speculated about, what its loss has meant, but it's been very, very difficult to, really get a handle on that. One of the things that is happening, for example, with American chestnut are attempts to restore it by getting back maybe genetically resistant varieties. But there still seems to be some question about what role fire would be playing in the restoration of American chestnut, and there are some disagreements about what role fire should play, with that species. If I may also point out that in addition to losses, we've also had some gains. We've had some additions to the forest that were not on this continent before, and those may have some really important impacts in the oak ecosystems of the eastern United States. Many of them are faced with understory non-native species that could be competing with native species and affecting their abundance and persistence. One species in particular that I've been looking at is Microstegium flaminium, or Japanese stilt grass is a common name for it. And it's a difficult one to deal with in terms of management, because it is shade tolerant, so it can tolerate these fire suppressed conditions that dominate a lot of our oak forests here in the eastern United States. But it also responds very positively to fire and the opening of canopies. So it actually ends up being a species that is almost like lying in wait in our forests. And then when we try to restore fire to those systems, it responds very positively to those restoration conditions, as well as some of our native species when they're not having to compete with that species. So there's a potential conflict, management conflict, dealing with that, and that's not just limited to this particular system. The conflict between fire management and invasive species is one that people see over and over again. They want to restore fire to some sort of historical semblance, but they're restoring it. They're trying to restore that ecosystem process to a system that now has species that were never there historically and could potentially, interfere with restoration efforts.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's really easy. I guess I get that question all the time when I'm presenting or whatever. people are like, well, if I open up the canopy and add fire, I'm going to end up with a bunch of bad stuff, which is a common problem, not diminishing that problem at all. And that one, because we see that happen, it's easier, I guess, for me to wrap my head around that than it is to wrap my head around what are the consequences of not having one of the most abundant species in it versus now having a really abundant one that was never there before. So a little easier to conceptualize, but you're exactly right. Both of those issues are confounding our efforts here. So
Can I add something to that real quick?
yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, it was really interesting trying to write this paper and to try to get it published because it got reviewed by, I think, 4 or 5 different reviewers. All of them had something to say about the section we tried to write about, why we think fire exclusion is so important, and, trying to give a nod to all these other different things that happen simultaneously with fire exclusion that could play into the compositional and structural shifts that we're seeing. And I think one thing that came out of all of that thinking and discussion and getting reviewer comments back from it is that it's really almost impossible for us to say definitively what combination of factors led to what is happening today. We know that fire is important, but we also know that there could have been a whole bunch of other things happening. And what factors were important were probably different depending on what site you're standing on. And so, but the most important thing I think that I gained from that process was that what we really need to be thinking about is what's important today. What is it that we need to think about today that could help us achieve whatever stand conditions we want to achieve for whatever objective it is that we're trying to manage for. And so, so that kind of led to like the rest of the paper, right? Like we had this part kind of thinking about what got us to where we are. And then there's this like, okay, well, what's going on now? What are the real issues and what do we need to do? And so it was a really interesting process kind of thinking through all of that.
Sure. I think that's a great segue into what I wanted to get into as well. We recognize that fire probably is playing an important role in the system. And certainly depending on what your objective is, if you're interested in regenerating oak or improving wildlife habitat or increasing plant diversity, all of these things fire can play an important role in. But once this forest structure, I guess, and composition has started shifting, it's making it more difficult to use that tool in the system. And I thought it'd be really interesting to get both of your perspective on this, since you're really interested and experts in understanding traits associated with these different species and how they influence the system, and more importantly, how they influence whether or not we can even use fire in the system to try to meet these goals. So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about some of these transitions in communities that have led to changes in fuels and how that affects our ability to manage it to begin with.
Well, I'll say something, and I know Heather will have a lot to say about the fuels and the changes in the fuels. One thing that I think people need to understand is historically in these systems, fires were frequent, and that frequent fire regime basically, I believe, served as a filter. And it was a filter that prevented a lot of the non-oak mesophytic tree species from entering the mid and overstory of the system. They may have actually been in these systems, but they would have been a sprout bank, or they would have been very, very uncommon and mainly restricted to more mesic floodplain systems. Those species like red maple, sweetgum, they're native species, and they were dominant. They were important in floodplain ecosystems in the mid-South, at least, and in much of the other parts of the eastern United States. And so what happened, I believe, with fire suppression is many of those species escaped what has been termed a fire trap. The fire was keeping them from becoming larger individuals in the forest. Well, now they are part of the forest as mid-size, trees, and those trees are not necessarily very sensitive to fire. And so simply putting fire back in is not going to put them back in the fire trap, okay? And that's why people have talked about the need to not just use fire, but come in and do thinning out those so-called off-site species. And then, but you also have to burn, because those species will resprout, and they resprout from fire. They don't resprout as, well, let me just say that their resprouting ability compared to that of oaks is context dependent. So if it's a system that doesn't have a whole lot of light getting to this forest floor, the resprouting to fire of those non-oaks is often better than what you'll see for a lot of oaks. And that's because the oaks are also hamstringed by not getting enough light. It's when you have the combination of abundant light and fire that you really see the oaks have that large resprouting advantage to fire, and the potential for flipping the system and getting it back to oaks regenerating into the mid-story and the mesophytes probably not doing as well as the oaks in that scenario. Now, I will say from my own experience, you're not going to get rid of those mesophytic trees, with frequent fire and restoration. I think the best you can really hope for is maybe just changing the size hierarchy, the size, getting oaks back into the mid-story, and maybe restricting some of the non-oaks back to maybe the understory. So yeah, I think that's one thing that I think is an important lesson that people have to be aware of, and that is that simply putting back fire is not going to get back what you had. It might eventually, if you keep doing it for a long time, but a much more efficient way would be to combine fire with other management techniques to try to change the competitive hierarchy of the oaks and the non-oaks.
Just to circle back to one of the things that you said, is once those plants, these non-oak plants get into the mid-story, or these trees get into the mid-story and overstory, they have escaped that fire trap and they're not necessarily sensitive to fire anymore. That was one thing I was curious what you had to say about how they're with the species traits. They're actually engineering their own environment to make them less, I guess, vulnerable to fire. And we've even cut a video that we have online that people can go and look at where we talk about this. But could you tell us a little bit about some of those traits and how these species do that?
Sure. So just to reiterate what Steve said, because I think it's really important, is that, once you take fire out of the system for an extended period of time and you allow species like sweetgum and red maple to get a hold, once they get big enough, they can resprout really well. And they still, sometimes even, I've seen trees that are 10 inches in diameter that, fire barely has an effect on. And those trees, once they start, they do two different things. One is they occlude light. So that impacts oaks directly, but that occlusion of light, and I'll let Steve talk about this more in a second, is what influences that herbaceous layer. So you stop getting things like, grasses and other really flammable herbaceous species in the understory. So you have a change in your fuel bed that's super important. So that's one way you change the flammability system, is you create a fuel bed that's now mostly leaf litter rather than being things like grasses. Well, and not only is it leaf litter, but it's leaf litter of species like red maple and sweetgum that have leaf litter traits that are really not very flammable compared to a lot of our upland oak species like post oak and southern red oak and scarlet oak, chestnut oak. Um, these non-flammable trees that are encroaching, they tend to have really, really thin leaves that don't curl very well. They're usually pretty small. When they fall on the forest floor, they hold a lot of moisture and they lay really flat and get really, really dense. So you try to put a flame on the ground and there's really nothing there that's going to ignite very well. And so you've got a fuel bed that's non-flammable litter, and then you've got a fuel bed that doesn't have any grasses in it, and now it's really shady as well, right? So then those fuels just stay moister longer than they would have if the canopy was open. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. You look at like an oak leaf, it tends to curl a lot. So you've got all these little points that are sticking up that it will catch a flame if it comes through. It creates a really kind of aerated fuel bed. So there's lots of oxygen, which fire needs to move through. And the non-oaks, like we've done some cool experiments, which we can talk about in a minute, but man, things like winged elm and sweetgum, those leaves lay so flat, stay so moist. And it's, it's hard to, you could put a drip torch right up to winged elm and it'll hardly move. So it's pretty interesting to see.
I think that we have actually done that.
We have. Yeah. Pretty interesting. Yeah. When we tried to set winged elm on fire and it did nothing, I was like, wow, this is what we're talking about.
Well, the thing that I found so interesting about that experiment, I mean, we literally went out, and when I say we, I mean mainly Jen, the graduate student at the time that was working on it. She had to collect all these leaves, but anyway, we actually went out and put a known ratio of oak to non-oak leaves in a fuel bed, and when I say fuel bed, I just mean on the ground in a defined plot, and then came back and tried to burn them. And that was my role in it. Best I recall was just to come and hold the drip torch and let you all measure all the really interesting things going on when I did that. But it didn't take that much, of the ratio being those non-oak species before it really started to affect fire behavior quite a bit. Yeah. And particularly as you increase the amount of non-oak, the fire just didn't perform well. It didn't burn well, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we had plots that were all oak, plots that were all non-oaks, and then we had like 33% non-oak and 66% non-oak. And it's a pretty linear trend. Like as soon as you put species in the mix that are not oaks, you decrease the flammability of that fuel bed. And this is just looking at leaf litter. So like I said before, a lot of the fuels in these systems, particularly when they're open, and there's a lot of lighter herbaceous species, but those leaf litter fuels, which are the dominant fuel in these systems now that we're trying to restore, you really have to have a bunch of oak or pine in there to get it to ignite and to burn well. So yeah, so this goes back to what you were saying or alluding to earlier, is that it's kind of cool to think about it, although not easy to manage for it, but it's like these different trees have different traits that actually help to perpetuate the conditions that they would rather be in. So if you're a tree that does well with like highlight and fire coming through every 5 to 7 years, which is what we think it was before we settled this part of the country, then you have traits that promote fire. And if you're a tree that liked hanging out by a river where you hardly ever had fire, or down in a cove, you've got traits that suppress fire. So it's kind of cool to think about how individual species kind of have certain traits that will promote the conditions that they like to live in.
Really cool. And to kind of tie that into what I wanted to talk about a little bit from a management standpoint is bringing it back to what Steve was saying earlier. I can remember looking at some of the historical land cover, maps and things. Even I think one of Bartram's called most of the eastern United States was labeled as Grand Savanne or something like that. So Grand Savannah, and that included a lot of the upland hardwood systems. So when I think about what that actually means, basically means a low density forest, right? So very few trees with a herbaceous dominated understory. And based on all these different kinds of records, it seems like that's probably pretty accurate of what structurally those systems look like. And they, of course, don't look like that now, but we do have some management practices. I'm thinking specifically like of the shelter wood with fire technique, which is specifically designed to regenerate oaks. And, I think about some of the studies that I'm familiar with, and you're probably more familiar with them than I am, where we've tried techniques like that, where the strategy is to go in and actually reduce the amount of canopy. So you have a timber harvest where you remove some of the trees, you leave oaks, at a low basal area in the forest, so you're getting a lot of sun to the ground, and then at some point after that initial timber harvest, you would come in with fire. And as far as I remember, those are still pretty inconsistent on regenerating oak. I was curious, is that your same feeling for what the literature says on that? And if so, why do you think that is?
From what I've read, there is some inconsistency. It seems like from my understanding, is that first of all, you have to make sure you have oak regeneration on the ground. That is, you have to have a sprout bank or seedlings, because fire itself is not going to produce those, and even opening the canopy itself is not going to produce that. So you do have to have that kind of starting point, that potential for oaks to respond. And then I think another thing that's really important with these shelter wood cuts is that you open up the canopy, but you might want to be wary about going in too soon with a fire. I think that's what several folks have found. I know I've found that with my own research, is that it seems to work better if you allow oaks that are basically in that sprout bank, small sapling, seedling bank, you allow them the time to actually take advantage of that increased sunlight. I don't know what all is going on there, but I suspect what they're doing is that they're using that sunlight to actually build up even greater below ground reserves. And so then what happens then, if that's allowed to happen, you put in a fire, and you'll get a lot of top kill of the oaks and of non-oaks, but the oaks sprout back much more vigorously, taller, not necessarily more sprouts, but taller sprouts. And then what I have found in my own work is that if you come back and burn again, then what you'll see with that sprout size difference between oaks and the non-oaks is that those sprouting oaks will then be more likely to avoid top kill with a subsequent fire than the non-oaks. And so I've heard of people being able to kind of release oaks with a single fire, delayed a little bit after shelter wood cut. But I think also that it may not maximize the number of oak, stems making it into the mid-story or upper story. But with repeated fires, I think that's more likely to kind of knock down the mesophytes and also help to maintain a more open canopy. If we want to keep this, we got to keep burning in order to keep, maintain the open canopy, and thus the benefits to the herbaceous ground layer.
Yeah, that's good points. And I think we make that point pretty often. When we're using fires to meet management objectives, it's pretty much always the case that you have to use it more than once. You have to continue to use it in a regime. We talked about that in one of the recent episodes, that it's really important to think about that regime and what that looks like. So another practice, I guess, Heather and I have engaged in on the site behind you in your in your screensaver there, Heather. So something that I found pretty interesting. It might be pertinent for a lot of people that are interested in burning their upland hardwood systems, but they've already kind of gone too far with this process where we have these red maples and other things are making it hard to get fire back in. You may not necessarily have or want the opportunity to harvest timber, but there still are some things that you could do. And one of the things that we were a part of in North Mississippi was a hack and squirt operation where we actually went in and targeted specific stems that are problematic. And you're not going in and harvesting timber, but you're actually just killing individual tree species that are invading, that are causing you issues with trying to get fire back in. So no, we put some of that information in the online video, Heather, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what's actually happening in that sort of scenario when you go in and do this kind of operation where you have this, pretty specific management treatment. Like, how is that benefiting you from a management objective?
Right. And Steve actually could probably talk about this a little bit too, because they did the same thing on his site. But the idea there is just to go in and individually target sort of smaller sized off-site individuals. Like we were really interested in getting rid of sweetgum and hop hornbeam and winged elm. And so you can go in and kind of quickly hack and squirt. So, cut the stem of the tree and put some herbicide in there, and that'll knock back those guys. And what it does is it keeps them from getting any bigger and occluding more light, but it also does open up the canopy a little bit, right? Like, right now, when you go into a lot of these stands, you're lucky if you've got 5% of total sunlight reaching the forest floor. It's usually really low. So just taking out those individuals can open it up 5 or 10%, which can make a big difference to your oak seedlings or saplings that are growing in the understory. It gives them more energy. And so if you do that, that's a mechanism to kind of get them growing bigger, faster. And then you can burn a little bit, knock back some of those guys, allow those oaks to continue to grow up, and then potentially later come in and take off some of that overstory, like you mentioned before. But Steve, maybe you want to talk about your luck, because you guys had some luck doing this on your Strawberry Plains site, right? And getting your herbaceous understory to look a little bit better.
Yeah. And originally we're thinking about maybe cutting and removing, some species, but, we didn't really have a big budget for doing that. And so, and we ended up deciding that we would do basically hack and squirt of the off-site, species. And we also found that it was beneficial maybe to also do that for some of the overstory oaks, just to increase a little bit of the sunlight. We had some data to suggest that, southern red oak may actually be, even though it was historically, one of the dominant species, its density today may be a little bit higher than it was historically because of fire exclusion. So we singled out a few of those too, but we were very selective about oaks. And one thing that was, we were also thinking about, since this was a Strawberry Plains Audubon Preserve is a bird sanctuary, is that just by deadening some of these trees, we also created a potential cavity trees for, say, like red-headed woodpeckers and other cavity nesting species. So that was kind of a side benefit of doing that. And what we found is that you definitely get a strong response of the herbaceous ground cover. For oaks to make it through that kind of bottleneck, generally we found that that was aided by some multiple tree fall gaps. So in addition to our thinning, having some of the Mother Nature help us with knocking down a few trees through wind throw, It's in those areas combined with maybe backing off the fire frequency. Initially, we started at once every 2 years, and that was probably too frequent to allow oaks to really make it through that bottleneck. But we back it off to like 3 or 4 years, then you really start to see the oaks coming into their own, into the mid-story. There's still also sweetgum in some of the mesophytes there too, but definitely deadening trees, can give you part of what you need along with fire. And another advantage of that, we thought, although we haven't really looked specifically at this in great detail, is that when you're not dragging trees out of there, then you're probably doing less damage to the ground cover. We were always very mindful of what would be happening to the ground cover with any activity that we were doing in there. So I think it can be done, extraction without doing too much damage to the ground cover, but it has to be done very thoughtfully and carefully with people who know what they're doing in that regard.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I like a lot of things about this. One, sunlight is often a limiting factor in there for my objectives, which is most of the time wildlife habitat, but it sounds like it's important for regenerating the next generation, so to speak, of oaks. But you're also doing it in a really an inexpensive way where you can be pretty specific and get rid of species like you were mentioning that really have a low wildlife value. They're also hampering, they're catching sunlight, they're hampering your use of the tool fire. So you're accomplishing a whole bunch of things at once with this relatively inexpensive and not very time-consuming practice that could be done on a stand-by-stand basis, depending on your objectives. And it's really getting you a long way and getting fire back into the system and getting, depending on what your objectives are, some of these objectives advanced. So, yeah, I really appreciate y'all taking some time to talk to us about that. And I was curious if you have any take-home messages before we end the show for today.
I think one thing that's really important for people to think about is that I think it's almost deceiving in a way when you walk around in an oak forest, because you think, oh, this oak forest looks great. There's all these big, beautiful oaks, usually in the overstory, and you're like, oh, everything's good. But, if you pay attention and look at what's hanging out, like who are the kids of those oaks? Are they actually there? Like, I'm astonished sometimes when I go out and I'm like, there is no regeneration, nothing. There's not a single sapling in this entire stand. And or if they're saplings, it's things like American beech or red maple. And the reality is that when those big oaks die, and they will, because most of them are 80 to 100 years old, that's when most of them are recruited, that time frame ago, they're going to get replaced by non-oaks unless we're actively doing things now to promote that regeneration. And sometimes I know, sometimes you almost cringe a little bit when you're like, Steve said, oh, we killed a couple of southern red oaks, and you're like, oh no, those guys. But then you're like, you almost have to do that sometimes, because the only way that you're going to get oaks to regenerate is if you keep the understory open enough. And right now, the only way for us to do that is going to be through opening up the canopy some, and then maintaining open enough midstory and understory that those oaks can thrive. And that's probably going to be through some sort of fire program. Usually at first you have to kind of burn pretty frequently. And then once you get that regeneration there, you've got to lay off, because you've got to let those oaks get out of that fire trap that Steve and you were talking about. And so, I think we're at the point right now where we have to do something, or 20, 30 years from now, we're going to be looking at forests that are very, very different than what we have been used to looking at.
Yeah, I would just add, one point about the aesthetics. I agree with you, Heather. I find it pleasant to walk through a closed canopy mature oak forest, and it does look nice. And I will say that if you decide you want to do this type of restoration where you're going to be deadening or thinning some overstory, hacking and squirting, burning, that you got to have some patience, because initially it's not going to necessarily look all that great. But over time, what happens is a lot of the dead, trees kind of fall. That herbaceous layer with a lot of showy wildflowers starts to take hold, and it's a different system then, and it has a beauty of its own. Okay.
You start to see a lot of really pretty birds showing up. I've worked with some landowners that love to see the birds, a lot of those things show up.
Absolutely. Lots of animals, lots of mammals, lots of things that have been shown to increase in abundance, with this type of management. And I would just add, with regard to that management of upland oaks, I guess I would like to see agencies be more accepting of this type of management, of restoring open, fire maintained woodlands that are dominated by hardwoods, by oaks. I think there's been definite buy-in for pine dominated systems, but it's been a little bit more of a challenge to convince people of the advantages of doing this for oak dominated systems. And I think, and I don't know where that comes from. It may be that that it's kind of, maybe some foresters don't see the value of fire in an oak system, for its timber value. But clearly there's great value for wildlife. And I think that I'm hoping that, more agencies, especially, here in Mississippi where I am, will come to embrace that more than they have.
That's a really good point, Steve. And I do want to point out that in the last couple of years or so, there has, I think, at least in some of the fire community, been more of an effort to kind of get that message out there. I think, there's been a couple of really good papers that Bryce Hanberry, who's with the Forest, published, talking about these open forests being kind of an excluded state, and that they really serve a lot of functions, particularly for wildlife. Like a lot of the biodiversity that we see is in these open forest communities, and oak forest included. And so I agree. I think that message just needs to get out there a little bit more. There's still a lot of people who don't think fire belongs in a hardwood stand, and that's a message that we've been trying to, get the word out that the fire is a part of that system, and there's a lot of evidence that shows why it needs to be and has to be, and you're not just damaging your timber trees if you put fire in a hardwood stand. There's a lot of way to burn those stand and do it responsibly and do it in a way that you can still harvest your trees and make money off them, and that's part of your management goal. And so I'd like to see that kind of a paradigm shift in the way that we think about fire and hardwood systems.
I think that's a great way to end with, that's what we're all doing here, right? We're trying to use every means possible, and now we're doing it through a podcast, trying to get information out to people. So I think those are great points. Really interesting discussion. I appreciate you both coming on and telling us what you know about these systems, and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, no problem. One last thing, if the listeners are interested in following up or some of this information, where can they find you all? So
you can find me via email. I am social media lacking at this stage, but it's heather.alexander@auburn.edu. I'm happy to address anybody's questions.
Yeah, email is probably a good way to contact me as well. And that's, even though I go by Steve, my email is actually jbrewer@olemiss, olemiss.edu.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to send an email to an Ole Miss address, I don't think. I'm just kidding. Yeah,
It'll go to
again,
the junk. It'll go to my junk. Yeah.
yeah. You just filter those out immediately. I get it. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate y'all again coming on the show. Really enlightening talk, and thanks everybody for listening in. We'll talk to you next time. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.